Okay, hello everyone. I'm Emily Donahoe, and we are coming at you live for this Q&A after Shakespeare in a Time of Plague. So I'm joined here by our three panelists, Arnaud Zimmern, Chanel Cox, and Lara Ortiz Mercado, and our special guest, Dr. Peter Holland, who we are delighted to have with us today. So I'll give Peter a brief introduction. Peter Holland is the Associate Dean for the Arts at Notre Dame, the McNeil Family Professor in Shakespeare Studies in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater, and also a professor in the Department of English. Before coming to Notre Dame in 2002, he was the Judith E. Wilson Reader in Drama and Theater at the University of Cambridge and the director of the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham. He's one of the central figures in performance-oriented Shakespeare criticism and has written or edited numerous books and articles on theater history and Shakespearean performance. He is currently one of the general editors for the Arden Shakespeare fourth series. So welcome to Peter, and welcome again to all of our panelists. Feel free to turn your screens on and join us. I just want to say before we get started, please feel free to our audience to type your questions in the chat, and we'll be addressing those as we go on. So thanks to everybody for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. I really enjoyed all the panel presentations, and I think we're going to have a great discussion today. So before we go into some of the live chat questions, I kind of wanted to go back and get a little bit more historical perspective on this period that we're talking about, with some basic questions about how people in Shakespeare's day might have dealt with the plague and how it's maybe different from how we deal with COVID-19 now. So just to preface this, none of us are medical historians. We are literary scholars, but some of us do have more expertise in that area than others. I'm looking at you, Arnaud Zimmern. So I wanted to ask, first, how did Londoners react differently to the plague than we do? And maybe especially for Arnaud, if you could talk about, you talked about in your presentation how governments and kings in particular kind of handled the plague through the king's touch. But I wonder if you could also give us a little bit of background about how, what else governments and rulers and leaders might have done during the period to manage the plague, and maybe how that's really related to or different from what we do now.
Sure, Emily. This is a urgent question for everybody in sense of,
Oh, Arnaud's frozen.
maybe the place to start is to realize, can you all hear me at all? Can you hear me now, everybody? Or am I still? Yes, fantastic.
Sorry, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll start back from the top maybe. The medical historians are all raving about this question at the moment, so I'm glad you asked it. The nugget we have to start with is the fact that they didn't understand plague with quite the same sense or quite the same understanding of transmission, right? So that's going to determine a lot of kind of how you respond, of course. We know the histories of people of just wealthier stock or more noble stock leaving out to the countryside under the premise that the air was cleaner there, right? And so you would be in kind of more healthy whereabouts. You know, if you know your Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, that's the whole premise of that story. There's a lot of it, again, in Emily mentioned Ben Jonson's The Alchemist during discussion. That's a similar premise for why things are going on the way they are. But maybe the most, I think, significant difference is just the way that the houses were set up in a lot of kind of early modern London. Do you really have separate rooms that you can quarantine in? Are multiple people sleeping in beds simultaneously? Yes, they are, absolutely. Multiple children, but also children with parents, multiple adults. So your questions of cuckoldry, to kind of give a little nudge to Chanel, is alive and alert because of the ways that your home spaces are built and the ways your bedrooms are built, and the idea that beds are not just for one person. So I think there's that. You also have to think about water evacuation systems. Not the same thing, right? You have this great scene in Henry IV Part 2 where Falstaff comes on stage and he says, "Empty the Jordan," and what he means is take my pot of urine and feces and dump it out the window. That is not as far as we know, unhistorical by any means. So you have to imagine that the disposal of waste matter and therefore the contagion is huge. Then, of course, you just have a very different relationship to animals, even in the cities, than to what we have here. I think psychologically, Emily, though, what's interesting, and I think it's a major difference, is you have all sorts of efforts to account spiritually and morally for the existence of plague that we just don't see as much. So we've mentioned throughout this conversation the fact that the plays don't seem concerned with talking about plague nearly as much as we are. We expect a kind of artistic reaction that reproduces the plague, but maybe we don't see it. I think if we shifted our lens over to the sermons, right, the other kind of major theatrical and performative space of early modern London, if you check out the pulpit and see what's being written there, you see a lot more literature about the plague because it is a moral crisis. It's a spiritual and a religious and a theological crisis that gets inflected differently whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant, or and even within Protestantism, if you're a Puritan, more of a Proto-Anglican. But we can go into more detail there. But I think it's a significant difference to try to understand the early moderns as trying not just to manage the pains and the horrors of plague, but to actually account for it, to give it a justification, and to try to find in their spiritual lives and in their moral lives, whether it be cuckoldry or other things, to find a way to redress the plague in their own spiritual kind of inner and inward lives, as well as kind of their hygiene. So hopefully that's a broad picture of what might be different here.
Oh no, I agree absolutely with everything you're saying. The one thing I'd want to underscore really strongly is that for us, this pandemic, all of us on this Zoom, this is the first experience we've had of a pandemic. We talk about Spanish flu in 1918. I watched interviews with two elderly women who survived Spanish flu and have now survived COVID, both over 102. But we've never encountered anything like this. So when I get up in the morning and I switch on my computer and I go to my news source, The Guardian, the UK newspaper online, I click on the corona map of the US and I check on how many cases were found in Indiana yesterday and how many deaths and how many hospitalizations. I've never done anything like that in my life before. But plague in Shakespeare's time was normative. It wasn't, is there ever going to be a plague? It's, is there ever going to be a moment when there isn't a likelihood of plague? Over and over again through Shakespeare's life, plague was rife in London. And so they had rules of how to deal with it. The mortality bills said, and the mortality bills were published parish by parish, how many deaths in the parish in the previous week. As soon as the number rises above a particular level, time for the theatres and all places of entertainment to close down. And Lara talked very eloquently about the whole way in which the meme of Shakespeare writing King Lear during plague has grown up. King Lear is a quite extraordinary play. I know, I'm editing it at the moment. I'm deep in the details of the text. But through year after year, it was common for the theatres to be closed more than they were open because of plague. And when plague hit and the theatres were closed, the actors might go out on tour into the countryside to visit other places, simply as a way of earning a living. No unemployment benefit, no other source of income. You better find some way of plying your trade as a player and get on the road, take up touring, get away from the city. But again, as you talked about in the panel yesterday, Shakespeare was born just after a time of plague in Stratford. Everywhere was used to it. And I think that's what is such a marked difference. Very early on in this whole process, early in lockdown, I had a phone conversation with a Notre Dame alum who's a vice president at Sony Pictures and looking at development for movies. And she said, what kind of movies do you think we'll be making? Do you think we'll be making something about Shakespeare and plague? And I said, I really don't think so, because we don't want to think that this is the new normal. We don't for a moment want to imagine that we are going to have plague, pandemic, coronavirus, COVID-19, COVID-20, COVID-21, year after year after year for the rest of our lives. But Shakespeare and all his contemporaries knew that there was no way out, that the number of the population that might go up who died from plague, it might go down. There would be good years and there would be bad years, but it was never going to go away. And that gives it a kind of quotidian normality in which you just lived with it. You didn't do something unbelievably special that transformed your lives. I've never spent time in lockdown before. I've never had to wonder about whether I can go to the supermarket and stay socially distanced from the other shoppers and feel angry about those people who are not wearing masks. I didn't have to walk down my street, stepping off the road to avoid people coming towards me so I can pass socially distanced. All of this is so new for us, but everything you did about plague in Shakespeare's time, all of it useless as a preventative, pretty much. But it was normal. And that normality means that's why people didn't bother to write about it, because it was simply normal. You know, there's a lot of things that happen in our lives that don't appear in the drama and other literary and other kinds of creative products of the period, precisely because they are so normal. We look for the unusual, the exceptional. Plague, oh gosh, bad again, better do something about it. Perhaps I'll go home. Perhaps Shakespeare went off to Stratford when plague was bad in London, but if he was still acting with the company, well, I better stay with the company and go on tour. It's normal.
Yeah, and Peter, you were talking about, this gets to another question I had about how, so there were no kind of long-term solutions to the plague, obviously, but there were things when plague outbreaks happened that theaters had to do short-term. And I wanted to ask a question about how the plague affected kind of the business of theater then, and maybe also transition talking about how it's affecting the business of theater now. But one of the things you mentioned, things that theater companies would do during the plague is go on tour and go out of London and into the countryside and tour productions. Could you talk a little bit about that process and when they went on tour? What's the scholarship on touring?
Just happily, but just before we get to that, I mean, just think what's happened now. So next week, I should have been in Stratford-upon-Avon at a Shakespeare conference, and every evening I would have been going to watch the Royal Shakespeare Company performing in one of its theatres in Stratford. The RSC is closed. You know, sooner or later, they will contact me and offer me a refund of my advance purchase of tickets, but it's going to be a while before they reopen. Many theatre companies now will never reopen. They will not survive this. Now, in Shakespeare's time, theatre companies came and went. They, as the phrase was, they broke. That meant they went bankrupt and they gave up, and then they reformed and actors would join different companies and so on. And touring was normative. Again, companies went out on the road all the time, and we can track them. There is one astonishing piece of scholarship. It's organized through the University of Toronto. It's the records of early English drama, and they have been charting county by county all the records for where the players were. We know that the players often visited Stratford-upon-Avon when Shakespeare was young. London players came to Stratford. Sometimes in Stratford as elsewhere, they were paid not to play. The town didn't want them to perform, and so they give them a small sum of money and now move on, get away, go on to the next parish. You know, we don't want your kind here. None of that kind of artsy-fartsy or subversive or dangerously lascivious theatre rubbish. We want nice things in our parish, in our town. And so the players will be paid to move on. But I've always loved the image of the fact that one of the things that the players would do when they visited Stratford would be to put on a performance for the town council. And when Shakespeare's father was the head of the town council, as it were in our terms, the mayor of Stratford, it's not the title he had, I like the image of Shakespeare kind of as a very small child standing between his father's knees and watching that play, perhaps the first professional play he ever saw. Do I have any evidence that he did? No, none whatsoever. But we enjoyed those kinds of fantasies of what might have happened. And I'm trying to get at the way in which London players were out on tour. Now, we've got something similar going on now in a quite exceptional way. I mean, I've been glued to my computer screen watching web distribution of productions I couldn't otherwise see. I've just been watching a couple of days ago an extraordinary production of Richard II from Shakespeare's Globe, from the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, the first ever professional production of a Shakespeare play performed entirely, by British women of color. And it's exhilarating to watch that. I couldn't get to it in London. I could watch it, I can now watch it on my computer. And so many things have become suddenly available to us because the theaters, thank goodness, want to reach out and show their work and have discussions, Zoom panels, just like this one, and Q&A and all the rest of it. I find that absolutely exhilarating.
And yeah, Laura, you mentioned this in your presentation yesterday. I'd love to get your take on this about the kind of accessibility of theater now, and maybe, so it's clearly COVID has had a terrible effect on a lot of theater companies, and as Peter mentioned, some of them will not survive. But as consumers of theater, we're being treated all the time to these great live stream productions or just productions on Zoom. People are making their archives available. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about how COVID-19 is maybe changing the way we're doing theater, changing the way we're thinking about theater, and maybe how it will change going forward. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I don't think I have any answers, but one of the things that I find most fascinating about this whole ordeal and the way that now Shakespeare has been made available for people is that it brings forth, again, and that's what I mentioned before, accessibility, like who can experience Shakespeare and how can they experience it, right? And maybe it's because it's from my own background, right? Like I didn't have access to a lot of like live performances of Shakespeare's growing up, or adaptations of it translated to Spanish, right? They have been more productions lately, but still, like where are they going, right? Like where are these companies going? Who can get access to this? Who can buy a ticket? It's the whole debate again that we had about Hamilton, like many years ago when it first came out, right? Like who can get to experience this new and brilliant thing that is happening? Who gets access to the arts? And Shakespeare is one of those things that as scholars, we often talk about, okay, what is our impact then on society? What are we contributing to our communities? How is Shakespeare relevant now? Well, if they can even access the plays, if they can even access performances, all they have is probably a script or some film adaptations, but they don't have the whole experience of Shakespeare, right? And it makes Shakespeare then very limited to a very specific academic community. And if it's the purpose of Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is not meant for, in my humble opinion, it's not meant for academics. It's not meant for the ivory tower. Shakespeare is something that is meant to be experienced by everyone. It's meant to continue having these debates about monarchs, about politics, about witchcraft and marriages and whatnot. And one of the things that this current quarantine that we're having is bringing forth is if now we can stream all these plays and we're giving accessibility to people, why couldn't we do it before? And what is preventing us from continuing that, right? Because yes, a lot of theaters, it happens to Broadway and plays in Broadways all the time. If we want to think to something closer to us, right? Like if there's a big snowstorm, usually in the winter, many plays end up like, as Peter was saying, like broke, right? Like they break up, they can never come back. It happened to Mamma Mia. It happened to a lot of like Disney plays that are usually on Broadway. And it's awful that these things happen. Certainly they're going to happen now. A lot of companies are not going to be able to go back again. A lot of people are losing their jobs. A lot of actors might not have the opportunity to return. But if we were able to make all of this available now, if we were able to invent or to manipulate the technology that we have available for us to continue celebrating Shakespeare during quarantine, what is preventing us from continuing to doing that forward? What is preventing us from, example, doing this panel that we're doing right now and giving access to everyone rather than just the people, let's say at Notre Dame, who can come physically to the panel discussion. So I think that's something like very interesting that is happening, and that it's going to prompt a lot of academics, producers, and actors to continue thinking how we can then go back to the roots of theater, but also allow for this new accessibility to continue forward.
Of course, Lara, I agree with the idea. The problem is quite simply there has to be income, and creating productions that are distributed free on the web is a highly expensive business. I mean, what the theatre companies have by and large been doing is distributing material that they already had. They're not making new material, they're just choosing to release it at this time as a kind of reminder of what they do. And for me, it's wonderful and exhilarating to watch this work, but it's not the same as live. And whatever we mean, and we can talk about that peculiar quality of liveness in the theatre, of that moment of encountering actors there speaking to each of us in the audience in real time, that's that quality that we want to get back to, desperately want to get back to. I want to get back to it as a playgoer, not because I'm a Shakespeare scholar, but because I love being in the theatre. I get a buzz out of watching plays. Good productions, bad productions, I still get a buzz. So we need that, because what we risk, what Shakespeare's companies and the other companies of his time risked, was losing their skills. When the company went bust, what did you do with your stock of costumes? What did you do with your stock of props? What did you do with the stack of plays that you, the theatre company, owned? Playwrights in Shakespeare's time didn't own their own plays. They sold them. Lock, stock, and barrel, no copyright issues, no royalties. They sold them to the theatre company that had often commissioned them to be written. And you took your fee and that was it. Shakespeare was unusual because he was a member of his company and he was an actor sharer. He took a share of the profits, and he cleverly was a member of the single most successful company throughout the early modern period in England. They lasted non-stop. They didn't go broke. They didn't get taken over. They didn't disband, and they kept going. And he made a lot of money that way as an actor sharer. So you could make a living that way. We have no such model. We have no model that enables us to know how to make theatre profitable pretty much anyway. Broadway apart, big musicals apart, Hamilton apart, most theatre doesn't make enough money. That doesn't mean it isn't good. It just means we haven't got an economic model that doesn't depend on grants and patronage and gifts and benefactors who give money so that the theatre experience can continue to happen. And that's not a viable model when there is no performance.
Yeah, of course. And going to that, sorry, real fast. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you've said, Peter. And there's something very magical about live theater, right? Like being in the place where it happens, to quote a famous musical that we all love. But one thing that is very, that I think is important is that as we continue moving forward, and absolutely once we reopen the theaters, we also consider like how then we can maybe make a profit online to try to keep it somehow accessible, even if we just release them after they've been produced, right? As the RSC is doing and National Theatre is doing. I can think StarKid, the theater company, started doing live YouTube, right? And they've grown into a big theater company that does live shows, but they still find a way to always record one of those shows so people who cannot go to Broadway can access it. So it's just a matter, I feel, at this point of both reopening the theater, continuing to try to make a profit that way and keeping alive the magic of the theater, while also figuring new ways to keep this sense of accessibility to people, even if it's just a recorded thing that we release after it's been staged.
And yeah, this is where we should mention that a little bit of funding from on high would be incredibly helpful. I mean, we should remember that Shakespeare, for a lot of his career, was he was in the King's Men, right? And he, you know, of course they made money off performances, but they have a patronage system where aristocrats were in some way also supporting the arts. So for all of you moneybags out there, support the theater, right? I want to talk, there's so much there that we could talk about. I want to talk more about this notion of liveness and physical presence and embodiment in the theater. And maybe I could connect this to some of the things that Chanel was thinking about in her paper. Chanel, you were talking at some point about how sometimes ideas in the early modern period, they thought that ideas had a real effect on the body, right? And a lot of the anti-theatrical literature from Shakespeare's day was really concerned about the sensory experience of theater and how dangerous that was, right? I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that embodied experience in the early modern period.
So something that's really interesting whenever you think about cuckolds as, you know, a walking infection, as I called them, you know, at least metaphorically speaking. Also, so you brought in emotion. So the kind of ironic thing, I guess, about being a cuckold is that so you're sort of transformed by the fact that everyone knows this thing about you that you don't know. So you have horns, but it's kind of like there's no winning in this situation, because if you were super jealous and always like trying to catch your wife cuckolding you, so for one, you were scorned for that. For two, like you mentioned, like you brought up, that emotion itself could make you sick. So actually, like, truly transform your body, not just, you know, you have horns, quote unquote, but it could truly transform your body, just the emotional experience of it. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I don't know, do you have a follow-up question? That's just kind of where my mind
I just kind of threw that to you. Like, do you want to comment? This notion of there's an article I read recently, and I regret that I can't think of the author, but this notion of affective contagion in the theater, and the way that an actor expresses emotion, and then you feel that emotion, and then, you know, there's a kind of contagion amongst the people who are standing in the room with you, physically present, of emotion, and how that transmits to people almost like a disease, right? I think that's
watching
really...
a scene of lust makes you feel lustful, and watching a scene of idleness makes you feel idle. And indeed, being in the theatre itself is an act of idleness, and therefore a bad thing. Capital B, capital T, you know. Going to the theatre is going to make you less likely to turn up for work. You know, entertainment is bad for you. Getting obsessed with it. Anybody here kind of parallels with video gaming or anything like that? You know, we can find our own parallels to that kind of thing. But I think what's so intriguing about the infectious nature of cuckoldry, as Chanel was talking about it, is that it's almost entirely a matter for comedy. I mean, Shakespeare's Othello, as a tragedy about somebody who believes he's been cuckolded, is extraordinarily unusual. Comedies are full of laughable characters who either are or think they are cuckolds. It's actually not funny to watch somebody who is a cuckold thinking he's a cuckold. It's funny watching somebody who's a cuckold who doesn't think he's a cuckold, and it's funny watching somebody who thinks he's a cuckold who isn't a cuckold. You know, that's what makes for the comedy. And one of the things I love about this is that Shakespeare seems to most of us to have found the name Othello in a comedy by Ben Jonson, his contemporary, that was set in Italy and has a figure of a husband who's deeply jealous and thinks he's cuckolded, whose name was Thorello in Jonson's play, Every Man in His Humour. That seems to be where Shakespeare is likely to have found the name Othello. So he takes a character in a very good comedy, I think Every Man In is a wonderful play, and then makes that at the heart of one of the most deeply distressing plays I know. I mean, the sense of the pain and exhaustion of watching Othello, as you know what is coming and you can do nothing about stopping it. It is so powerful because it starts with that classic domestic experience of a couple where nobody can quite understand what she sees in him and he sees in her. Except, you know, she's young and Venetian and rich and beautiful, and he's none of those. So I'm trying to get at that way in which one of the things Shakespeare does is to take something that is normal in other kinds of plays and that is laughable everywhere else, and then he stabs us as he gets us to watch it. I mean, it is for me one of the most painful plays I've ever seen.
And Othello is one of those Jacobean plays we were talking about yesterday. The Jacobean period had kind of more frequent outbreaks of plague. And I was noticing that, like, this is my hot take for the moment, that a lot of the characters in those plays seem more isolated. And it is, of course, kind of debatably a great period of like high tragedy for Shakespeare. So I think it's very interesting to connect all of that to the plagues that were happening. I wanted to ask a question along those lines about plague and social unrest. So we are seeing a lot of upheaval in America and in other places in the world too right now. And it's in part driven by the inequalities that COVID-19 has exposed. And I wonder if there's any way we could connect kind of social upheaval and the plague in the early modern period. I don't know a lot about this at all, so this is just kind of a shot in the dark. But if anybody has thoughts, I would love to hear them.
I don't think there are plague riots. I think survival was the issue during plague, not protest. What does happen, and it's something we forget about in the period, is local uprisings over the lack of food. You know, one of the most threatening things was successive years of bad harvest. And clearly one of the things that we know was underpinning Shakespeare's decision to write Coriolanus, a play which begins with the citizens of Rome rioting because they believe that the patricians, the aristocrats, have got a great store of grain and the people are starving in Rome. And Shakespeare is building on what had been happening in the Midlands. I mean, not far from where he grew up in Stratford, very close. I mean, within, you know, comfortable walking distance of where he grew up, of people protesting because they were hungry. Local famine. Now we've got versions of this now. You know, food banks are overrun with the demand, but that's not what our unrest is about the moment in the US. It's not about an unrest of hunger, but in Shakespeare's time, hunger drove people towards social unrest. I'm not suggesting that somehow it's okay to be hungry now. It's a terrible thing that in the United States, so many people go hungry to bed. I mean, that distresses me very, very deeply. And in the UK, where I'm from as well. But there is a difference between that being the result of the natural force of bad harvest, and plague is part of that kind of natural thing. And you know, Arnaud's concern with that, rightly, with that sense of how this becomes a kind of, from the sermon, from the pulpit, an indictment of the moral failure of the community. Why is there famine? Why is there plague? It's your fault, you're not being moral enough. I don't actually think that's why plague happened. I don't think that's why bad harvests happen. I don't think that's why COVID happens. You know, but this is the way in which certain groups within all societies explain the natural phenomenon. It must be our fault.
Arnaud, would you like to weigh in on whether or not the plague is our fault?
I'll hold off on a comment on that one. But I think, Emily, you pointed out that the plague has really exposed a lot of not just political tensions, but racial tensions. We know that, obviously that these things have co-aligned not just by serendipity, but for obvious reasons. And I think Shakespeare, maybe not so much in the plays as in the sonnets, is aware of the larger kind of waves of iconoclasm going on during the Reformation. And so you have a sonnet like Sonnet 55, and I'm thinking again of Patrick Stewart's renditions lately that have been really beautiful to watch. It's a sonnet that begins, not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme, right? And he goes on to say that when wasteful war shall statues overturn and broils rid out the work of masonry, not Mars his sword, nor war's quick fire shall burn the living record of your memory. So this is an ode to the the youthful boy of the sonnets, about how ultimately poetry is going to live through the statues and live through the masonry and live through even the waves of war and iconoclasm. But I think it's been really interesting to have Shakespeare during these times as a form of solace, who does live on a living record of his memory. And we can dispute whether or not we agree with the particular statues that have been taken down, or if there are other statues that we think should have been left up for various reasons. But I think it's interesting that Shakespeare's plays, maybe because of their unmonumentality or because of their textuality, remain vivid for us to rewrite and revise without having to tear down quite as devastatingly. But they do raise very much the question for us of when we do tear down, when we do kind of go through a wave of iconoclasm, whether justly or unjustly, whether out of a sense of reform or out of a sense of indignation, what are we going to erect instead? There's a kind of phoenix-like dimension to Shakespeare's writing and to Shakespeare's works that I think we keep coming back to. And that is kind of tied into the tides of sickness and cure inherently. That this is a rhythm that the early moderns, Peter has rightly pointed out, were habituated to, that you go through bouts of absolute kind of cyclic paroxysm, everything is held up, but you know that there's going to be some sort of ending, and at that point we will have to rebuild. We will have to grow out of the ashes again. And so I think there's something about Shakespeare that's fascinating that way, that it's so keyed in to those facets that he ends up being, as he was, out of the ashes of Nazi Germany for so many Germans, Hamlet and not The Taming of the Shrew, what am I thinking of? Shylock were so kind of essential plays for thinking about how to emerge from a huge crisis. We have a similar opportunity here. So to kind of tie in with your question about how do we get the theaters alive again in new ways, I think it's going to be also about rethinking how we do acting. If we don't have the kind of play of proximity, of familiarity, of contact and touching that we're so accustomed to in, say, the handsy scenes between Falstaff and Prince Hal, or the kind of close love and affection between, say, two lovers. How do we use COVID and everything that's happening now to think of a Romeo and Juliet so distanced from each other across a room? How do we reinvent Shakespeare for a period that has now been kind of viably and legitimately scarred by this experience of isolation and distanciation?
And it has affected us so deeply that I find that when I'm watching a movie made 20, 30 years ago, and I look at a scene and I think they're not socially distanced. I can't help it. I mean, the language that we have invented in the last 4 or 5 months to deal with what we're going through powerfully informs our sense of our own bodies and how distanced we might be or should not be from others. I'm just waiting on a mask I've ordered, a face mask I've ordered, that simply reads, "Thou art too close." Because for the first time, we are now anxious, even about our friends being too close to us. I mean, my natural instinct, when I see a friend, is I want to put my arms around the friend and hold them, because that's my way of expressing my friendship. It's one of the ways in which I manifest that emotion through my body, through proximity. to another person. And I can't. And I can't. And I find that painful and yes, inhibiting, but that's a weak word. Something that my rational brain is having to control my physical activity in a way that I don't want it to. I want that emotion to be available. And so much of what Chanel was talking about is about emotion flowing through the experience of the cuckold and so on. And the cuckold depends on a cuckolder and a spouse who is also an aider and abetter of that process. It's, for cuckolding to take place, there are 3 people to be involved. And their proximity and their kinship relations and so on are part of what defines the possibility of that. Now we're terrified of somebody breathing too close to us. We go in our local supermarkets here in South Bend. We are not socially distanced as much as people have learned to be in Europe, where they stand outside socially distanced and are allowed in when there is enough space for all the customers inside to be socially distanced. And I feel intense anxiety going shopping now in a supermarket in a way that is unimaginable earlier and is now the new normal. And it's about physical proximity. And theatre is so much about that. I mean, the Shakespeare's Globe in London has announced, they can't reopen because their economic model depends on something which will not allow, it can't work if the audience is socially distanced in that space. And that thrill in the Globe in London of being close to, rubbing shoulders with people in the yard, standing throughout the production, watching it in the company of hundreds and hundreds of total strangers, that's too dangerous for us now. And I worry about what that says about how we are approaching our own bodies. And that sense of embodiment that Emily was asking us about seems newly to take on an element of terrifying risk. If somebody breathes on me, they might kill me. I've been saying to people, I have never ever been conscious of my age in the way I am now. As a senior, I'm in the most vulnerable section of the population. Did I worry about that in January? No. Am I worried about it now? Yes, I wake up in the night worried about it. That's new. How we transmute this into drama, how we turn a Shakespeare play into material in which we could see that, that's actually a rather thrilling prospect, not a troubling prospect, a thrilling one, because it calls on deep reserves of creativity amongst the wonderful people who make theatre to ask us to reimagine how that might be.
And we will see what the future holds for the theater. And I think, when we can get back together, and I have faith that one day we will be able to be in physical proximity with one another again. I think it'll be a really exciting time for theater artists and artists in general. So we look forward to that with a lot of eager anticipation. We are quickly drawing to a close on our time here, but I wanted to end with something a little bit more uplifting. So recently I was listening to a podcast from the Folger Shakespeare Library on Shakespeare and solace, and they asked a lot of actors and a lot of Shakespeare scholars if there are particular plays or passages from Shakespeare's plays that they are turning to now in the middle of this crisis for comfort, for inspiration, for motivation, for solace. And I wanted to ask that question of each of our panelists to close right now. Are there beautiful or inspiring moments in Shakespeare that you would point the audience to at this particular moment? Don't all speak at once.
Choose us. Go in whichever order you like. Pick on us.
Well, Peter, since you've got your mic on, why don't you start?
I've been trying to think. I don't think there's a particular kind of speech that comes to mind that gives me solace, but sitting here as I am at the moment in my study with, the papers and debris of my writing around me, almost every time I open a copy of Shakespeare and I read that extraordinary language, that somebody could have written that exists, gives me solace. And like all great art, the wonder is that it ever occurred. I mean, how was it possible that anybody, Glover's son from Stratford, or the Earl of Oxford, if you happen to believe that only aristocrats are intelligent enough to write great works, could have written that? Just as I don't understand how Mozart could have written most of Mozart's music. There is that quality and genius that is awe-inspiring as a tribute to what the human mind can do, that I find gives me profound solace all the time. Not in big speeches, just in tiny twists of phrase, in small moments, not just great ones. And that's a magic that keeps me going.
Emily, I mean, now that Peter has mentioned the Oxfordian thesis, this video is going to go viral. So we might as well all say something that's really important for fighting like xenophobia or something. And in that theme, since the COVID, virus was so associated with China and led to so much kind of hate speech against Chinese immigrants and different Asian immigrants to the US, I would just think about like checking in with the life of Sir Thomas More, which Shakespeare writes a beautiful speech about, and gives the lines to Thomas More speaking to a London public that's growing xenophobic. I think we've grown very fond of that particular speech as a scholarly community, but it's still worth getting to know just out in the public, and rewards mulling, and sitting with and kind of stewing with. So that's been my go-to lately.
Yeah, that's a beautiful speech. And obviously, since we don't have the full version of Sir Thomas More, we don't get to see it performed. So if you haven't heard of Sir Thomas More, go and check out that speech. It's a really, really interesting speech. I think there's video of Ian McKellen reading it, which is luminous. Lara, would you like to go?
Sure. The one thing that I keep quoting every time that someone gets near me or someone asks me some ridiculous question about COVID because they don't believe in science is from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 3, line 87. No, just say no. Like there's no shame in just saying no. Also, for passing the time, if anyone wants just a quick laugh during all of this uncertainty, Sonnet 135. Amazing. Highly recommended to everyone.
All right, well, we'll leave with that little tidbit of mystery. Go check out Sonnet 135. Chanel, do you have any passages or plays that you like to turn to?
I don't think anything specifically, but I've noticed reading for my master's, like my grad exam. I've been reading diaries lately, and just reading literature from the period, especially whenever it comes to play, because I'm reading the Diary of Anne Clifford right now, and she kind of complains about the plague. Oh, when she's little, she can't go to this event because her mom won't let her because the plague's going on. Like, oh, mom, come on. She experiences, family members getting sick all the time. They don't even know, most of the time they don't know if it's the plague or not, because a lot of symptoms, they're just not sure. But I guess the biggest thing, just from the literature in general, is realizing that all of the emotions we're feeling have been felt before. And what we're going through right now, others have gone through and, got past. And I think Shakespeare especially has this talent, he's known for writing the most human characters. I think there's a book where they talk about like he invented the really, I can't remember what it's called. Does anyone remember?
Harold Bloom.
Like he invented the human.
Very controversial selection.
Yeah. Yes, but there's just this general idea about him that, he captures life. And that's solacing, I guess. That gives me solace.
Yeah, thanks. That was very wise, Chanel. And I want to thank each of you for your great presentations and a great conversation. I've had a fantastic time talking about this over the last couple of days, and I really appreciate each of your contributions. And thanks to the Notre Dame Shakespeare Festival for allowing the Early Modern Circle to come in and have a little bit of conversation. We were super excited to be here, and we hope that everybody watching at home will continue to support the Notre Dame Shakespeare Festival. So I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, Emily,
Right.
our wonderful moderator.
Thanks to everyone.